When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the chaos and slaughter of the First World War had come to an end. But for the millions who would return home, bringing with them the scars, both physical and psychological, of the war, it seemed to bring little comfort. In fact, despite having won arguably the most important war up to that time, in France and Britain, the victory seemed to be met with a deep cynicism. And in fact, an anti-war sentiment would come to define both countries and would play a decisive role in the opening salvo of the next World War. So how is it that two empires, which would grow to their greatest heights and take vast reparations, could come to view that war so bitterly? Hi all, I'm not an upper-class twit, and today I'm going to be discussing how the victory for the Entente in France and Britain would come to be met with a feeling of emptiness, and that the war itself in the victory was proved to be not worth it. So, before I talk about the world after the war, I'm going to actually start before the war began. I am going somewhere with this is important. So, before the First World War in France, between the years of 1871, the end of the Franco-Prussian War, up to 1914 when the First World War began, it was a time known as the Belle Époque. Basically, it was a time of glory, prestige, success, art, culture, and innovation. It was the good years. France had something known as the long 19th century, but basically from the French Revolution up until the Franco-Prussian War, France had been in a state of chaos, constant warfare, political upheaval, and revolution. And it wasn't until the Belle Époque that France found itself in a relatively more stable state. The governments were still ever-changing, as is France, but culture and science and industry were all reaching new heights, and the French Empire was at a real pinnacle. Now, obviously, colonialism has its very damaging qualities, shall we say, but France was benefiting massively from the empire that it had carved out for itself. It had access to trade the world over and resources everywhere. And politically, France had managed to craft a very strong relationship with the Russian Empire, meaning that in the event of another war with the Germans, France would now have a major ally that could help split Germany's forces up. So going into World War I, France was looking pretty good. Similarly, Britain was in a kind of golden age. You had the biggest extent of empire ever achieved. You were surrounded by powerful and very loyal dominions in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. You had a navy that was untouchable, an industry that dominated the world, a scientific sector that was famed the world over. All of these qualities had led to Britain enjoying probably the most prosperous era in its history over the course of the 19th century. And by the First World War, Britain really had very little incentive to get involved in European affairs. I mean, Germany was an upstart power that had been trying to rival Britain, for sure, but Britain had essentially managed to win that race. They still had the largest navy in the world, they still dominated global trade, and they still had essentially the largest empire ever. So, all of that in mind, when you think about the years before the First World War, you realize France and Britain did not really have a lot to gain from the war. That's not to say that they didn't want it. Particularly France, after the Franco-Prussian Wars, really wanted vengeance for losing Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. But when you actually look at the nitty-gritty of it, both of them were in very powerful positions, and anything other than a very fast war in Europe would have been to the detriment of the boons that they were already enjoying. And that's essentially exactly what we saw. Throughout the war, the Belle Époque and its grandeur would come to be a bitter reminder of how good life had been before the war, and only emphasize how miserable life had become during, which of course naturally raised the question, if things were so good then and are so bad now, why are we fighting? And this question would only become more frustrating when the peace deal was finally signed. See, France and Britain did come away victors, but the war had not ended with a triumphant breakthrough or a decisive victory, but instead attrition. And that attrition had required all sides to become completely exhausted. The cost of the conflict was immeasurable in terms of lives, material, and money. And what ended up happening was most of the nations that came out of the war were destroyed by it. Austro-Hungary had collapsed, as had the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire was now in the midst of a civil war which would prove as deadly as the First World War had. Germany was on the brink of starvation, as was much of Europe. And many minor nations, like Belgium and Serbia, had been so brutally destroyed by the invasion and occupation of the Central Powers that they essentially had to be entirely rebuilt. Being the only nations really left standing, Britain and France had to take on a lot of the duties in this, which wouldn't have been so bad initially, since America was now on the stage. But the main problem would come when America, being in a position of strength as essentially the only country in the planet that hadn't been devastated by the war, now being able to dictate new terms. Woodrow Wilson would push the idea that all nations should have some sort of state, although of course this would only be applied in the context of Europe, and would be applied in a rather naive way. The idea of it seems good on the surface, that people should be able to dictate their own terms and have their own representation. But what this meant was, in these collapsing times of chaos in Europe, every people that wanted their own nation now had to rush and grab territory so they could go to the treaty signers and say, oh, this town is actually ours, and that town, which led to a spiral of violence in a lot of Eastern Europe. Just look at how many wars Poland fought with essentially all of their neighbors in the interwar years. As well, France and Britain, along with the Americans in large part, had to become incredibly involved in trying to prevent starvation across Europe. Huge amounts of money had to be provided to who was essentially the former enemy to ensure that they didn't starve and fall into total anarchy. Britain and France did gain land, France importantly getting back Alsace-Lorraine, and Britain and France both taking territories in the colonial world, but both of these were actually probably more damaging to Britain and France than they were helpful. A lot of the land that France and Britain would take in places like Africa and Asia had only been minimally developed, since Germany had only actually really taken those colonies in the 1880s or later. This meant that in places like the Congo or Cameroon, there was actually very little there that Britain and France could benefit from, but they now had to spend the money and time to develop and police those regions. This was especially problematic in the new Middle Eastern territories that France and Britain were trying to take, which dragged both of them immediately into many new colonial wars to try and enforce their control over the region. The immense cost of colonial policing was also going to balloon in the aftermath of the First World War for two major reasons. The First World War had begun to spread the idea of national sovereignty. A lot of British, in particular, propaganda had emphasized that Belgium had a right to nationhood and sovereignty, which Germany had destroyed, and that was kind of their justification for getting involved in such a brutal struggle. Yet Britain failed to uphold this value when it came to its own colonies. Even for the loyal colonies, like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, the cost of the war and, frankly, incompetence of British high command had really deeply shaken the loyalty of those nations and moved all of them to a more independent footing. And for places like India or West Africa, who had sent enormous numbers of soldiers into the front lines, only to be met with slaughter and racism, it was a shocking moment that both shattered the invincibility of European armies, seeing them be defeated in the field in the First World War, and also proved that there was no good faith from the British or French Empire. They had no values that they extended towards these colonized people, even those who had laid down everything to fight to uphold their empires. All of that to say, when America created the League of Nations and immediately pulled out of it, Britain and France found themselves on the hook for both the new world order of Europe they hadn't really wanted, as well as maintaining colonial empires that had just become far more unruly and far less profitable. None of that is going to leave you in a position of saying this war was worth it. Beyond just the mass global insecurity that the First World War brought, within Britain and France themselves there was also a lot of change. Britain had been relatively directly untouched by the conflict, other than the German bombing campaigns that provided their own source of horror for British civilians, but British psychology was affected by the war. Britain found itself really affected by the millions of men now returning from the conflict who had been killed and wounded, and the conflict had started to challenge the sort of social conventions and class nobility that was so ingrained in British society. See, British officers were very often paid commissions, which meant that it was rich guys' kids who were taking on very important command positions in the British Army. This led to a lot of soldiers feeling that it was these upper-class twits that had led to the cost of the war being so high, these donkeys leading brave lion men into the slaughter. Of course, those conclusions weren't entirely fair, but it made for an easy scapegoat, which only exacerbated tensions between lower-class Brits and the upper classes, which were already not ideal going into the war. This became especially exaggerated in certain parts of the country, like Wales, Northern England, and Scotland. Ireland, of course, would even break away, leading to decades of sectarian guerrilla violence. But you can see how British society was becoming fundamentally challenged even within the island itself. On top of all that, you of course had many social changes, some of them good, like women getting the right to vote and entering the workforce, but there was a lot of pushback to that when men returned home from the war and expected to go back to their jobs. Suddenly now there was an entire generation of women who had experienced the independence of having a job and expected political rights and representation. And there was an entire generation of men who had just been told that they had put their lives on the line for their country and felt betrayed that they weren't being supplied with a good job and career in tow. Those tensions would only be exacerbated by the fact that Britain was a lot less secure than it had been going into the war. See, a lot of the British economy had to be retooled for wartime production, which meant they now had to essentially retool again for a consumer economy. And Britain had found itself essentially unable to sustain itself in the war. Canada provided a huge amount of Britain's food supplies, as did America and India. And on top of that, all of the resources that were fueling the British economy were broadly coming from outside of the island. This insecurity was only made worse by the fact that the Royal Navy was not as invincible as had been hoped. The Battle of Jutland was essentially a British victory, but the German High Seas Fleet had gotten dangerously close to beating the British Navy, and had they managed to, Britain itself could have been in a blockade that was even more devastating than one that they had managed to put on the Germans. All of this meant that British society, its values, its economy, had all been really shaken. They had gone from a position of high esteemed glory to a very shaky and rapidly changing one that many Brits were, quite frankly, unable to cope with. France had it even worse than Britain, because the war in the West had been mostly fought in French soil. That, of course, meant that a lot of French land was unusable now, poisoned by gas and churning artillery, which to this day is unsafe to use. But on top of that, the area that was occupied by the Germans, which only amounted to about 3% of French land area, was actually 8% of France's population. A significant occupation, which had its certain difficulties. Now, some of them weren't the fault of the Germans. The German army requisitioning civilian infrastructure was an inevitability of military occupation, and another unfortunate consequence of the German population starving was that French-occupied people starved as well. If Germany can't feed its own people, you can't exactly expect them to feed French civilians. But there were other things the Germans did that are less defensible. The German army requisitioned a lot of forced labor in France and Belgium, which came with injuries, illness, and even death for a lot of French civilians who were, in some cases, teenagers. As well, the German army essentially stole everything that they could from the local economy, all the resources, all the industry, every machine that they could get their hands on, which meant that when France finally liberated that region in the aftermath of the war, They found a malnourished population on the brink of starvation with no economy at all. One of the most important regions of France now was a basket case that had to be fully rebuilt to try and save that millions of population, on top of the already millions of men who were coming back from the war injured or otherwise needing support from the state. The burden of the conflict was really felt in this way on a population level. For both countries, there were few people that could truly say they were unaffected by the conflict. You knew someone who died. You probably even were related to somebody who was, if at least coming back from the war, totally changed by it. And all of that meant that British and French society had come out of the Belle Époque and the glorious age before the war into a very bitter, grim, and dark one. Now, I realize that for many, many other nations, the First World War had been far, far more devastating, and the feelings at the end of the war being hopeless and bitter is fairly universal. But what's interesting to me about the situation of France and Britain specifically is they won. And they won in a way that allowed them to get most of what they could have wanted going into the war, only to find out that even everything they wanted was not worth the price the war would take. That kind of realization leads to a very tough set of feelings. I think we can often be fairly unsympathetic to the British and the French in the interwar years. There's a lot of emphasis that appeasement was cowardly and foolish, that the Nazis and Hitler were obviously going to try and expand and antagonize Europe, and that Britain and France could have snuffed it out sooner. And there is truth to that. But I think without understanding this strange sort of social upheaval of values and the simple fact that people in Britain and France were faced with a very stark realization that war is not worth the price, really goes a long way in explaining how it was that Britain and France came to want to avoid a war so desperately in the 1930s, despite all logic seeming to show another one was on the way. None of that is to necessarily excuse appeasement or to say that we should have more sympathy for the people of Britain and France than other nations. And in fact, a lot of what Britain and France did in the aftermath of World War I and its treaties has led to destabilizing influence the world over, and ultimately would be the undoing of their own empires once the Second World War kicked off. But I do think that there is value in trying to dissect the emotional toll of a conflict like the First World War, because it can be hard to imagine just how radically it changed everything. I do truly believe that the First World War was probably the most decisive conflict in history in every way but military. It completely reshaped the global economy, politics, social values, and reshaped the world in a way that we are still living in the wake of to this day. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you have your own opinions on British and French anti-war sentiment, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I know it's been a while since I made another video. If you can't tell by the backgrounds and the outdoor shots, I've moved. So, sorry for the delays. I'm hoping to get stuff going now that I finally got things set up. It took me a little bit longer than I would have liked. But thanks for watching the video. And if you could go like, comment, and subscribe, it does go a long way to help. So, thank you, and see you next time.